Have you ever woken up from a nightmare so vivid that your heart races, your breath falters, and for a fleeting moment, you question if you're still dreaming? My name is Elliot Hawthorne, and I thought I understood the boundaries between reality and imagination. As an art restorer, I've spent years breathing life back into centuries-old masterpieces, uncovering the stories they hide beneath layers of dust and decay. But no amount of skill or training could prepare me for the story I'm about to tell. It began as a dream, no, a vision, a haunting so vivid that even now, I question whether I ever truly woke up. The night it started was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and feels unnatural. I remember falling asleep with the weight of exhaustion pulling me under, only to find myself standing in the middle of an unfamiliar room. The space was massive yet suffocating, a grand gallery cloaked in darkness, except for the pale moonlight spilling through fractured windows. The paintings that lined the walls weren't just old, they were alive. The eyes of each subject followed me, their gazes heavy and judgmental, as if they could see into my very soul. As I moved deeper into the gallery, the temperature dropped. My breath condensed in the frigid air, and a faint, sickly sweet smell wafted around me. It was the smell of something long dead, but not entirely at rest. The wooden floor beneath my feet groaned with every hesitant step, the sound echoing far longer than it should have, as if the room itself were alive, amplifying my every move. And then I saw it, the portrait. Massive and imposing, it dominated the far wall of the gallery. The frame was intricate, almost baroque, with grotesque carvings of faces frozen in silent screams. But it was the figure in the painting that held me captive. A man with sharp, angular features, dressed in rich, dark clothing, stood against a background of swirling shadows. His eyes, they weren't paint. They were something else. They shimmered, catching the faint light, and for a moment, I could have sworn they blinked. My chest tightened as a whisper filled the air, low and indistinct, like 100 voices speaking at once. The sound didn't come from the room. It came from the painting. The man's lips moved ever so slightly, but no sound escaped them. I tried to turn away, but my body refused to obey. My feet felt rooted to the spot, my gaze locked with his. It was then I realized the other paintings, the ones I had passed, were changing. The faces were no longer serene or still. They twisted and contorted, their expressions warping into grotesque parodies of fear and pain. The whispers grew louder, the air thicker, until it felt like the gallery itself was closing in on me. Before I could scream, the ground beneath me gave way. I was falling, tumbling into an endless void. The man's cold, unblinking gaze burned into my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I woke up. My heart thundered in my chest, and the room was silent again. But the terror didn't leave me. It lingered like a shadow, as if something had followed me back from the dream. Before we go deeper into this chilling tale, let me ask you, have you ever experienced a nightmare so vivid it left a mark on your soul? If so, you're not alone. Subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles and join our community of fearless explorers. Hit that bell icon, because the stories I share will make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. And remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Let's step into the darkness together, if you dare. It began like any other night. I drifted into sleep, unaware that my subconscious was about to lead me into something far more sinister than a mere nightmare. In my dream, I stood at the entrance of an enormous, decaying gallery. The air was damp and cold, clinging to my skin like a wet shroud. The walls stretched impossibly high, disappearing into a shadowy ceiling that seemed to pulse as though it were alive. The flickering light of an unseen source cast eerie patterns across the room, making the entire place feel like it was breathing around me. The gallery was filled with paintings, hundreds of them, each more unsettling than the last. Their subjects stared back at me with expressions that seemed too vivid for brushstrokes. They weren't just images, they felt like frozen moments, stolen from lives that had long since faded into oblivion. As I took my first step inside, a faint but unmistakable sound reached my ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, as if someone, or something, was knocking from within the walls. I moved forward, the ancient wooden floor creaking beneath my weight, the sound reverberating like a scream in the silence. The smell hit me next, a mixture of linseed oil, mildew, and something metallic like old blood. It was the kind of scent that settles deep into your lungs, heavy and sickening. I tried to focus on the paintings, but the room felt alive, its shadows slithering just beyond the edges of my vision. As I continued, my eyes fell on a particularly large painting hanging at the far end of the room. It stood apart from the others, draped in a dusty black cloth that seemed to ripple as if something beneath it was moving. A sudden wave of nausea swept over me, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pulled the cloth away. The portrait beneath was unlike anything I had ever seen. It depicted a man with impossibly sharp features, his gaunt face framed by deep shadows that seemed to writhe within the canvas. His eyes, black as voids, seemed to pierce through me, locking me in place. But it wasn't just the man's appearance that unsettled me. It was the way he seemed alive. His chest rose and fell ever so slightly, as if he were breathing, and his lips were curled into a faint, menacing smirk that spoke of secrets I didn't want to uncover. Suddenly the room shifted. The light dimmed, the tapping sound grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. My chest tightened as the air became heavy, making each breath a struggle. The man in the painting leaned forward ever so slightly, just enough to make my heart stop. I stumbled backward, desperate to put distance between us, but the floor felt wrong. It wasn't wood anymore, it was soft and yielding like flesh. A voice whispered my name, low and guttural, reverberating through the gallery. "Elliot," it called, dragging out each syllable as if savoring them. The sound wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing against my ears. I spun around, searching for the source, only to find that the other paintings had changed. Their serene faces were now twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. And then, as if compelled by an unseen force, I looked back at the portrait. The man's hand had moved. It was no longer resting at his side. It now pointed directly at me, his bony finger trembling slightly as though it were alive. A crack echoed through the gallery, sharp and sudden, as the frame of the painting began to splinter. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the painting's glass shattered outward, raining down in slow motion. From the ruptured canvas, a black, viscous substance began to ooze, pooling at my feet and crawling toward me like a living thing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The shadows coiled around me, pulling me closer to the painting. The man's eyes seemed to grow, consuming the entire canvas until there was nothing but blackness. I felt myself falling forward into the void, the whispers growing louder until they became deafening. And then silence. I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, my heart pounding as though I had run a marathon. But the worst part was the lingering smell. The faint, metallic tang of blood still hung in the air, as if the nightmare had followed me into the waking world. The dream was only the beginning. I didn't know it then, but I had awakened something that would not be so easily forgotten. Something that would haunt my every waking moment. As I stood there, frozen before the portrait, the air seemed to thicken around me. It wasn't just cold, it was unnaturally heavy, as if the room itself was suffocating me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes crawling over my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted in place, caught in the magnetic pull of the man in the painting. His gaze wasn't just painted, it felt alive, piercing through me, peeling back layers of my mind as though searching for something buried deep within. Behind me, the faint tapping sound grew louder, more insistent. It echoed rhythmically, like the slow beat of a dying heart. I turned slowly, the hairs on my neck prickling as I scanned the room. The other paintings seemed to have shifted imperceptibly. Faces that once held calm expressions were now twisted into grotesque masks of fear and agony. Their eyes, wide and glassy, appeared to plead with me, as if they were trying to warn me of some unseen horror. I took a step back, my foot sinking slightly into the floor. Glancing down, I saw that the wood was no longer solid. It had a damp, spongy texture, as if the floor itself was decaying. Panic surged through me as I stumbled toward the nearest wall, my hands brushing against the rough surface. The wallpaper, once faded and peeling, now seemed alive, pulsating faintly beneath my fingers. A faint whisper slithered through the air, so soft it could have been imagined. At first, it was indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in a distant wind. But as it grew louder, the words became clear. "He sees you. He's waiting." The voice was neither male nor female, but something in between, ethereal and inhuman. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming from the painting. My gaze snapped back to the portrait, and my stomach churned. The man had moved. His head, once tilted slightly upward, now faced directly forward, his unblinking eyes locking onto mine. The smirk on his lips had twisted into something far more sinister, a cruel grin that exuded malice. The shadows around him seemed to writhe and stretch, spilling out of the frame like ink seeping into the air. The tapping suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that pressed against my eardrums and made my head throb. My heart pounded in my chest as I became acutely aware of another presence in the room. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, an oppressive weight bearing down on me, filling every corner of the space. It was watching, waiting, and I knew it was something far beyond my comprehension. I turned toward the source of the earlier tapping, a door I hadn't noticed before, slightly ajar with a faint, flickering light spilling through the crack. The light was an unnatural shade of red, pulsating like a heartbeat. My body moved on its own, drawn toward the door despite every nerve in my body screaming for me to turn and run. As I approached, the whispering began again, louder this time, as though dozens of voices were speaking in unison. They overlapped, their tones frantic and desperate, but one word repeated clearly among the chaos: leave. My hand hovered over the door, trembling as I hesitated. The wood beneath my palm felt unnaturally warm, pulsing faintly as if alive. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and windowless, its walls covered in the same pulsating, decaying wallpaper. At the center of the room stood a table, and on it, another painting. This one was smaller, but the figure it depicted was unmistakable. The same man, now older and even more sinister. His eyes were hollow voids, and his skeletal fingers reached out of the canvas, clawing at the edges as if trying to escape. A sudden noise behind me made me whirl around. The door had slammed shut on its own, trapping me in the suffocating red glow of the room. My pulse thundered in my ears as the walls seemed to close in, the whispers growing into a deafening cacophony. My vision blurred, and I stumbled toward the painting, desperate for something, anything, that could anchor me. As I stared into the man's void-like eyes, a single, raspy voice emerged from the chaos. It was his voice. "You shouldn't have come," it said, each word dripping with malice. The figure in the painting began to shift, his body twisting and contorting unnaturally. His mouth opened wide, wider than should have been possible, and a darkness unlike anything I had ever seen began to spill out, engulfing the room. In that moment, I knew I wasn't just a spectator in this nightmare, I was a part of it. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished with me. The room was shrinking, or at least that's what it felt like. The pulsating red light grew darker with every passing second, as though the shadows were feeding on it, swallowing the last remnants of safety. My legs trembled, my body screaming at me to move, to escape, but I was paralyzed, anchored by the horrifying scene unfolding before me. The man in the smaller painting continued to shift, his grotesque features stretching and twisting, as if the canvas could no longer contain him. A sudden crack echoed through the air, a sound like splitting wood, though no furniture had broken. My head snapped toward the source, and I realized it wasn't the room. It was the frame of the portrait. The ornate wood was splintering, jagged edges curling outward like claws. The painting itself seemed alive, its surface rippling as though it were breathing. I took a step back, my chest heaving with panicked breaths, but my gaze remained fixed on the horror before me. The figure in the painting now moved with fluidity, his bony fingers clawing at the edges of the canvas. His hollow eyes burned with a dark, otherworldly light, and his smirk widened into a grotesque, gaping grin. His head tilted unnaturally to one side, and his voice came again, soft at first, but dripping with malice. "You came too close, Elliot," he hissed, each word slow and deliberate. "And now you cannot leave." "My name." He said my name. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. How did he know me? Was this still a dream, or had I crossed some line between reality and the impossible? The air grew colder, the chill biting into my skin as frost began to creep across the floor. The walls, once alive with pulsating decay, now seemed to close in, the grotesque wallpaper peeling back to reveal raw, blackened wood beneath. Then the painting screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was a sound so guttural and distorted it made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them entirely, resonating directly in my skull. The figure in the painting thrust his arm out of the canvas, his skeletal fingers curling as if reaching for my throat. The room trembled, the floor beneath me shifting and cracking as if the entire house were about to collapse. Desperation took hold. I turned and lunged for the door, but the handle burned hot under my grip, forcing me to recoil. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, overlapping in a chaotic chorus of warnings and pleas. "Don't run," one voice hissed. "It will find you," another sobbed. My chest tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears as the air grew impossibly dense. I turned back to the painting, now glowing with a sickly, pulsating light. The man's body was halfway out of the frame, his limbs impossibly long and twisted. He dragged himself forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. His gaze never wavered, those hollow eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my knees buckle. In a desperate act of defiance, I grabbed the nearest object, a rusted candlestick from a forgotten corner of the room, and hurled it at the painting. The metal struck the canvas with a deafening crack, but instead of tearing, the surface rippled like water. The man's expression twisted into fury, his mouth opening impossibly wide as a torrent of black, inky smoke poured out, filling the room in seconds. The smoke was alive. It coiled around me, cold and suffocating, seeping into my lungs and dragging me to my knees. My vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into darkness. Through the haze, I could still see the man's figure looming over me, his skeletal hand reaching out. His voice echoed in my mind, no longer confined to the air around me. "You were chosen, Elliot," he growled. "And now you are mine." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The floor beneath me gave way, and I fell not down but through. The sensation was indescribable, as if I were being pulled through layers of reality itself. The world twisted and fragmented around me, flashes of distorted images and haunting whispers filling my senses. And then I woke up. My body jolted upright in bed, drenched in sweat, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The room was silent, but the terror lingered like a physical weight pressing down on me. My hands trembled as I reached for the bedside lamp, its familiar glow doing little to dispel the dread that clung to me. But the worst part, the part that still haunts me, was the faint, lingering scent of decay and the unmistakable sound of tapping from somewhere within my apartment. The nightmare wasn't over. It had followed me. The morning after the nightmare, I sat at the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the floor. My body was awake, but my mind was stuck in the dream. Every detail replayed itself with unsettling clarity. The shifting paintings, the suffocating whispers, the man in the portrait who somehow knew my name. I kept telling myself it was just a nightmare, a product of exhaustion or stress. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had followed me back. The first clue came when I went to wash my face. As the cold water splashed against my skin, I glanced up at the mirror. For a split second, my reflection wasn't mine. It was the man from the painting, his sharp features and void-like eyes staring back at me. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. When I looked again, it was gone, replaced by my pale, trembling face. Trying to shake off the unease, I spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to focus on anything. My apartment felt different, darker, colder. Shadows lingered in corners they shouldn't, and the faint tapping sound from the dream returned, so soft it could have been dismissed as the creaks of an old building, if not for its unsettling rhythm. Desperate for answers, I turned to the only thing that made sense: research. I searched online for any mention of a gallery or portrait that matched the one from my dream. Hours passed as I sifted through obscure forums and forgotten archives. Just when I was ready to give up, I found it, a single thread on a dark, antiquated website. The title sent a chill down my spine: The Malignant Portrait, A Curse in Oil. The post described an infamous painting, lost to time, known for bringing madness and misfortune to anyone who gazed upon it. According to the writer, the painting was rumored to depict a man named Elias Blackthorne, a reclusive 18th century artist who vanished under mysterious circumstances. The legends claimed Blackthorne had imbued his final work with something unnatural, a piece of his own soul, cursed and malignant, doomed to ensnare anyone who crossed its path. My stomach churned as I read further. The gallery from my dream was mentioned, a grand estate long abandoned after its last owner disappeared without a trace. Local legends spoke of strange noises, inexplicable lights, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. One detail struck me with icy clarity: the tapping sound. Multiple witnesses had reported hearing it before vanishing, their cases unsolved to this day. But the most horrifying discovery came when I found an old, grainy photograph of the painting. My blood ran cold. It was the exact portrait from my dream. The man's sharp features, the swirling shadows in the background, even the grotesque carvings on the frame. It wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't imagining things. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I contacted local historians and archivists, hoping to learn more about the gallery. Most were dismissive, brushing it off as folklore or urban legend. But one person responded, Margaret Hale, a a historian who specialized in cursed artifacts. Her email was brief but chilling. If you've seen the painting in your dreams, it's already too late. The malignant portrait doesn't just haunt, it hunts. Meet me at the old Blackthorn estate tomorrow. I'll explain everything. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his hollow eyes watching me, his twisted smile promising something far worse than death. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from inside the walls. At one point, I swore I heard my name whispered in the darkness. The hours stretched on, each one heavier than the last. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but resolute. If there was even a chance of ending this nightmare, I had to take it. As I left my apartment, I glanced back and froze. There, on the wall above my bed, was a faint smudge of black paint. It hadn't been there before, and as I stared, it began to spread, forming a shape that was terrifyingly familiar, the outline of the sigil from the painting's frame. I knew then that I wasn't just uncovering a mystery. I was walking straight into its jaws. The Blackthorn estate loomed before me, shrouded in mist and silence. Its towering, crumbling facade was a monument to forgotten history and despair. The windows, broken and blackened, stared down like empty eyes, watching my every move. The air around the estate was unnaturally cold, biting into my skin despite the early morning sun. I stood at the iron gates, hesitating, my breath forming small clouds that vanished too quickly. Somewhere deep in my chest, a primal instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. The dream, the portrait, the sigil, they had pulled me into a vortex of terror that left no room for retreat. Margaret Hale was waiting near the entrance, her face pale and shadowed as if she, too, had been haunted by sleepless nights. "You came," she said, her voice low and wary. "I wasn't sure if you would." She handed me a flashlight, its beam faint against the thick fog. "Once we go inside, there's no guarantee we'll leave the same. Or leave at all." Her words carried a weight that made my stomach churn, but I nodded. I had no choice. The moment we crossed the threshold into the estate, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the decay of time. The house itself felt alive. The floorboards groaned beneath our steps, not like wood settling, but like a living thing recoiling from our intrusion. The smell of damp rot and old paint filled the air, thick enough to taste. Shadows shifted along the walls, moving in ways that defied the dim light of our flashlights. Margaret led the way, her footsteps slow and deliberate, as though she feared waking something that slumbered within the house. "The painting," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is not just cursed. It's a trap, a doorway to something far older and darker than any of us can imagine." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "Those who dream of it are marked. It calls to them, pulls them closer until," she trailed off, her sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. As we moved deeper into the house, I noticed strange markings etched into the walls and floors, symbols that matched the sigil I had seen on my bedroom wall. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if imbued with a sinister energy. "What do they mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. Margaret hesitated before answering. "They're bindings. Wards meant to contain whatever is tied to the portrait. But they're old, weak. And if you've seen the sigil outside this house, it means the containment is failing." The weight of her words pressed down on me like a physical force. The painting wasn't just cursed, it was alive, and whatever was inside it was growing stronger, reaching beyond the confines of this decaying estate. As we entered the main hall, a low, rhythmic tapping echoed through the space. It was the same sound from my dream, only louder now, more deliberate. Margaret froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "It's awake," she whispered, her face draining of color. "We need to move quickly." The tapping seemed to follow us as we ascended a grand staircase, the steps covered in a thick layer of dust that muffled our footsteps. The walls were lined with more portraits, each one depicting figures with faces that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. Their eyes followed us, their expressions morphing from stoic to fearful as we passed. My chest tightened, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, not by the paintings, but by something far more malevolent. At the top of the stairs, we found a set of heavy double doors, their surface carved with intricate patterns that resembled the sigil. Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible. "The gallery. The painting is inside." The tapping had grown louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side of those doors knew we were coming. Margaret pushed the doors open with a creak that seemed to echo endlessly, revealing a cavernous room filled with rows of paintings. The air was suffocatingly cold, and the faint red glow from my dream illuminated the space, casting long, flickering shadows. At the far end of the gallery, the portrait hung in its grotesque frame, just as I had seen it in my nightmare. The man's face was unchanged, his hollow eyes locking onto mine with a force that made my knees weaken. The shadows around him writhed like living things, spilling out of the painting and onto the floor. Margaret and I stepped closer, the floor beneath us vibrating with each step. The tapping was deafening now, resonating through my skull and making my vision blur. "We have to destroy it," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "It's the only way to break the connection." She handed me a small, rusted knife, its blade etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the red light. As I approached the painting, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around my ankles and pulling me back. The man in the portrait began to move, his skeletal hand reaching out of the frame, just as it had in my dream. His voice echoed through the gallery, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Elliot," he hissed, his grin widening to reveal rows of jagged black teeth. "You can't escape me." Panic surged through me, but I gripped the knife tightly, its cold metal grounding me. The painting pulsed with a dark energy, and the sigils on the blade grew brighter as I raised it, aiming for the man's chest. The shadows screamed, a sound that was both human and not, as they lashed out, clawing at my skin and dragging me closer to the painting. With a final surge of desperation, I plunged the knife into the canvas. The room exploded with light and sound, a deafening roar that shook the entire estate. The shadows recoiled, writhing and dissipating as the man's face twisted in agony, his eyes burning with rage before fading into nothingness. The silence that followed was deafening. The tapping was gone, the shadows had vanished, and the red light had faded. Margaret and I stood in the ruined gallery, breathing heavily, the painting now nothing more than an empty, charred frame. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Whatever I had faced, whatever I had banished, wasn't gone, it was waiting, watching. And it wasn't finished with me. The silence that followed the destruction of the painting was suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Margaret and I stood in the dim gallery, surrounded by the broken remnants of something far older and darker than either of us could comprehend. The charred frame of the portrait still hung on the wall, its intricate carvings blackened but intact. My hands trembled as I lowered the knife, its glowing sigils now dimmed. I wanted to believe it was over, but the oppressive air in the room told me otherwise. Margaret broke the silence, her voice low and unsteady. "We need to leave," she said, her eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the edges of the room. "This place, it's not safe anymore." She turned toward the doors, but before she could take a step, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the gallery. It wasn't a whisper or a growl, it was a laugh. The sound sent chills racing down my spine, reverberating through the air as though it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows along the walls began to shift and stretch, their inky tendrils creeping across the floor toward us. Margaret froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "It's not over," she whispered, her face pale with fear. "We didn't destroy it, we unleashed it." The air grew colder, and a sudden, violent wind tore through the gallery, extinguishing our flashlights and plunging us into darkness. I clutched the knife tightly, its cold hilt the only thing grounding me in the suffocating blackness. The laughter grew louder, deeper, until it became a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. From the corner of the room, a faint red light began to flicker. It pulsed like a heartbeat, illuminating the far wall where the painting had once hung. But the frame was no longer empty. The man had returned. His features were no longer confined to the canvas. He was stepping out of the portrait, his gaunt, skeletal figure towering and distorted. His eyes burned with a malevolent glow, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed to split his face in two. Margaret screamed, stumbling backward as the figure advanced toward us. The shadows around him writhed like living things, coiling and snapping at the air. "You think you can destroy me?" the figure hissed, its voice a deep, resonant growl that filled the room. "I am older than this house, older than the canvas that held me. You cannot destroy what was never alive." Panic surged through me as I grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her toward the doors. But they slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The figure moved closer, its long, bony fingers reaching out as the shadows surrounded us, wrapping around our legs and pulling us toward him. Margaret struggled against the shadows, her voice frantic. "The knife," she shouted. "The sigils. They're our only chance." I looked down at the blade in my hand, its once bright symbols now faint and flickering. Whatever power it held was fading, but it was all we had. The figure loomed over us, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You were chosen, Elliot," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Chosen to carry my mark, to spread my will. You cannot fight what you were meant to become." His words were like daggers, cutting through my resolve and filling me with a deep, bone-chilling dread. But then I noticed something. The sigils on the knife pulsed faintly whenever the figure spoke, as though reacting to his voice. An idea, desperate and reckless, formed in my mind. I turned to Margaret, my voice shaking. "The knife reacts to him. If we can draw him closer, if we can use his own power against him, we might have a chance." Margaret's eyes widened, fear and determination warring on her face. "That's insane," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's all we've got." With a deep breath, I stepped forward, holding the knife out in front of me. The figure's grin widened, his voice echoing through the gallery. "You cannot harm me, Elliot," he sneered. "You are mine." I tightened my grip on the blade, focusing on the faint pulsing of the sigils. "Maybe I can't destroy you," I said, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "But I can seal you away." The figure lunged, his shadowy form enveloping me as his skeletal hand reached for my throat. I plunged the knife into his chest, the blade sinking into the swirling darkness. The sigils blazed to life, their light cutting through the shadows and filling the room with a blinding brilliance. The figure let out a deafening roar, his form writhing and contorting as the light consumed him. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners of the room as the figure's voice faded into a haunting echo. The red light disappeared, and the gallery was plunged into silence once more. When the light returned, the room was empty. The portrait was gone, the frame shattered into splinters on the floor. Margaret and I stood in the middle of the gallery, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The knife lay at my feet, its sigils now completely dark. "It's over," Margaret said, her voice hollow. But as I looked around the gallery, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only delayed the inevitable. The house was still watching, still waiting. And deep down, I knew the figure wasn't gone. He was still out there, waiting for his next chance to return. In the days that followed, I couldn't escape the lingering weight of what had happened. The Blackthorn estate was a distant memory, yet its darkness clung to me like a shadow. Margaret had disappeared, vanishing without a trace the day after we escaped the gallery. My attempts to contact her went unanswered, her phone disconnected, and her email bounced back with cryptic errors. It was as if she'd been erased from existence. At first, I convinced myself that her disappearance was her way of moving on, escaping the horror we'd unleashed. But deep down I knew better. Something had claimed her, and it was coming for me. The nightmares returned with a vengeance. Every night, I found myself back in that cursed gallery, standing before the empty, shattered frame. The shadows crept closer with each dream, whispering secrets I couldn't understand, their voices merging into a low, guttural chant. The man's face haunted me, his hollow eyes and cruel smile etched into the fabric of my mind. Even in waking hours, I felt his presence, a cold breath on the back of my neck, a faint tapping sound in the walls of my apartment. One night, I woke to find my reflection in the mirror staring back at me, but it wasn't me. The man's features twisted and flickered in the glass, his grin widening as he raised a single skeletal finger to his lips. "Shoo," he whispered, his voice low and mocking. "It's not over." That was when I began noticing the sigil. At first, it appeared faintly, etched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror or traced in the dust on my desk. But it didn't stop there. I started seeing it everywhere, on the backs of receipts, in the graffiti on alley walls, even burned into the bark of trees. The sigil followed me like a curse, a grim reminder that whatever I had fought at Blackthorn wasn't gone. Desperate for answers, I returned to the forums where I'd first read about the malignant portrait. New threads had appeared, filled with accounts from others who had dreamed of the gallery. Their stories mirrored my own, encounters with the man in the painting, whispers in the dark, the sigil marking their lives in ways they couldn't explain. But none of them had survived long enough to escape. One post stood out, written in shaky, fragmented sentences. "The sigil is a key. It binds him, but it also lets him in. Don't look for him. Don't speak of him. And whatever you do, don't answer when he calls your name." I slammed my laptop shut, my pulse racing. The shadows in the room seemed darker, thicker, as if they were closing in. The air grew cold, and the faint tapping sound began again, louder this time, echoing from every corner. My heart pounded as I turned slowly, the hair on my neck standing on end. There, in the dim light of my living room, stood the figure from the painting. He was no longer confined to the canvas or the gallery. His skeletal form loomed over me, his hollow eyes burning with malevolent light. The shadows around him writhed like living things, reaching for me, pulling me into the abyss. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs refused to move, my body frozen as the man leaned closer, his voice a cold, guttural whisper that sliced through the air. "You thought you could destroy me," he hissed. "You've only opened the door wider." The room dissolved into darkness, the shadows consuming everything. The last thing I saw was the man's face, his cruel smile the only thing left in the void. When I woke, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by sterile white walls and the hum of machines. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious in my apartment, the room trashed as though a storm had torn through it. They couldn't explain the strange burn marks on my arms or the deep scratches along the walls. They called it a psychotic break. I knew better. Since then, my life has been a blur of paranoia and dread. The sigil continues to appear, growing darker and more vivid with each passing day. The tapping never stops. And every time I close my eyes, I see him waiting in the shadows, his hollow eyes promising that the nightmare is far from over. Now, as I sit here recording this, I have to ask you, have you seen the sigil? Have you felt the cold breath of something watching you from the darkness? If you're here, listening to this story, then you've already been marked. Look around. Are you alone? Are you sure? If you've made it this far, you're part of this now. Share your theories in the comments. What do you think he is? Why was I chosen? And most importantly, what does the sigil mean? Subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles and hit the bell icon for more stories like this. Stories that make you question reality itself. But remember, the more you delve into the darkness, the harder it is to find your way back. Until next time, if you dare to return.